The wind still carries a faint salt tang where the Mediterranean once whispered against the docks of ancient Alexandria. On this shore, time itself seems to pause, just long enough to remember what once stood here. The Library of Alexandria was more than walls and shelves. It was an act of faith in human curiosity, an effort to tame the infinite. Long before the first papyrus was set upon the stone tables, there existed only the dream of collection, of gathering the many tongues of the known world into one unified voice. Under the new rule of the Ptolemies, Alexandria was to become the center of the earth's understanding, a lighthouse not only for sailors, but for the mind. Scholars believe the idea began in quiet conversation, perhaps between the philosopher Demetrius of Phalerum and King Ptolemy I Soter. They imagined an institution that would draw all written wisdom within its walls: Egyptian records, Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, Indian medicine. The ambition itself seemed to stretch the boundaries of possibility, but Alexandria was a city born from ambition. By the 3rd century BCE, ships bound for its harbor brought scrolls from every direction. The harbor's officials inspected each vessel, confiscating any written work aboard. The originals were copied quickly by trained scribes. The copies were returned to the owners, and the originals remained within the royal library, marked with the inscription ex apo ton ploion, or from the ships. Every arrival became a contribution to eternity. The library was part of a greater complex, the Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses. Within its marble halls, scholars lived as residents, working in sunlight by day and lamplight by night. The Mauseon combined the functions of a school, a sanctuary, and a research institute. There were gardens for study, observatories for astronomy, and long arcades where scholars debated as they walked. Inside, thousands of scrolls were laid out with careful intention, philosophy beside poetry, medicine beside music. It was a place where the mind could roam without boundaries. From the upper balconies, one could see the lighthouse of Pharos across the sea, its flames sweeping the horizon, a tangible reflection of the library's metaphorical glow. Knowledge itself was light, and the city of Alexander sought to harness it. A haven for scholars. They came from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Mathematicians, physicians, astrologers, historians, translators, poets. For them, Alexandria was not merely a destination but a devotion. They lived in state-supported housing, ate at public tables, and discussed the mysteries of life as equals beneath the same colonnades. Among them was Euclid, who distilled geometry into its timeless axioms. Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision, using only the angles of shadows between Scene and Alexandria. Herophilus studied anatomy, daring to map the human body with remarkable detail. Callimachus catalogued the library's vast collection into what was perhaps the first comprehensive bibliographic system, the Pinax. These names are known to us, but countless others remain forgotten, their contributions dissolved into the manuscripts they preserved. The library's power resided not only in famous discoveries, but in the delicate rhythm of daily scholarship, the rustling of scrolls, the scratch of reed pens, the murmured exchange of language between minds. A city of contradictions. Beyond the marble walls, Alexandria pulsed with paradox. It was both Greek and Egyptian, pragmatic and spiritual, modern and ancient. Along the Canopic Way, the main street stretching miles from the harbor to the necropolis, Greek architecture met hieroglyphic stone. Philosophers debated the nature of the soul in the marketplaces, while priests carried out sacred rituals older than the city itself. In this mix of ideas, tension always simmered. Knowledge was power, and power could be dangerous. The library depended on royal patronage to survive, and thus it became intrinsically tied to politics. The Ptolemies saw the library as proof of divine legitimacy. To possess the knowledge of the world was to inherit its destiny. Yet such grandeur made the library a vulnerable symbol, too precious, too central, to be safe forever. The fragility of immortality. Scholarly life was not always serene. Scrolls decayed in the humid sea air, copying demanded endless patience. One damaged manuscript might take weeks to restore. Each generation of scholars saved what they could, retranscribing collapsing papyri onto new stock. Yet the rhythm of loss and renewal was constant, as if the library waged war against time itself. Outside its marble sanctuary, winds of conquest began to shift. The Romans looked toward Egypt with growing hunger. Julius Caesar's fateful arrival would soon rewrite more than politics. It would test the resilience of memory itself. But before the flames, before the ruin, there was harmony, a sense of wholeness so vast it could be mistaken for eternity. In those moments, the library stood not merely as a building, but as an idea incarnate, that understanding the world could bring peace to it, that knowledge, gathered with care, could outlast everything else. As the centuries passed, the marble of Alexandria's colonnades grew soft with salt and time. The library still stood as a jewel of learning, but its brilliance had begun to flicker. Outside its luminous halls, empires moved restlessly. The tides of control that washed over the Mediterranean would soon reach the shore of knowledge itself. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when decline began. Perhaps it was not a single event, but a gradual erosion, like sand slipping from beneath marble foundations. Scholars came and went. Royal patronage shifted with every new dynasty. The Ptolemies who once cherished the library began to guard it as a political symbol more than a living institution. What had been born from curiosity risked suffocation under ceremony. Shadows over the harbor. By the 1st century BCE, the city still dazzled, but change was in the air. Ships docked in the great harbor now bore Roman standards, their soldiers walking where scholars once had. The library continued its operations under careful supervision, but the tone of the age was different. The questions pursued inside its chambers were not those of transcendence, they were those of survival. Outside, the lighthouse of Pharos still blazed, an eternal flame reflecting the library's ideals. Mariners said it could be seen from 50 miles at sea, a symbol of homecoming. Yet within the library, fires of a different kind were quietly smoldering. Envy among courtiers, suspicion among priests, and the ever-growing tension between nations. The first fire. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar came to Egypt in pursuit of Pompey. His arrival brought the Roman civil war to Alexandria's very doorstep. The royal city became a battleground, its delicate order undone by chaos. To secure his position, Caesar commanded the burning of ships in the harbor, a tactic to block his enemies. But the wind was unkind. Carried by sparks and confusion, the flames leapt beyond the docks, sweeping into the adjoining quarters. Ancient historians speak differently of what followed. Some said it was a small fire, contained quickly. Others, like Plutarch, claimed that the flames reached the library itself, consuming thousands of scrolls. Perhaps part of the great collection perished in that single night. Or perhaps the main archive, deeper within the royal quarter, survived wounded yet breathing. No witness recorded the full truth. What is agreed upon is that Alexandria never again spoke of the library in quite the same way. The invincible aura of permanence had cracked. For the first time, the world realized that even knowledge could burn. Ashes and silence. But ruin did not come all at once. The library endured, diminished but alive. Later rulers tried to repair what could be saved. Scrolls were recopied, catalogs restored. A secondary branch, often called the daughter library, was established within the Serapeum, a temple dedicated to the god Serapis, where Greek philosophy met Egyptian mysticism. This sacred annex became a new sanctuary for wisdom. Music, mathematics, and astronomy were taught beside the old rituals. The Serapeum stood as both temple and classroom, its pillars rising against the Alexandrian skyline like a defiant memory of what had been lost. In its halls, the scholars persevered, working more modestly now, but no less faithfully. Perhaps they sensed the impermanence of their refuge. Perhaps that very realization lent their work its quiet intensity. When you know something is slipping away, each act of preservation becomes an act of reverence. The Age of Echoes. In these later centuries, Alexandria entered a kind of twilight. The great names of learning slowly gave way to those who interpreted them. Commentaries replaced discoveries, glosses supplanted creation. The scholars turned increasingly inward, protecting fragments of ancient insight rather than forging new ones. Yet even this, in its way, kept the library's spirit alive, a duty of guardianship rather than discovery. Scribes still copied the works of Homer, Hesiod, Aristotle, and the physicians. The texts crossed borders, translated into Syriac, Latin, and Coptic. Each generation carried forward a flicker of the old flame, unaware that soon it would be tested by darker tempests than any before. Faith and fire. By the 3rd century CE, the harmony that once stitched Alexandria together began to unravel. The world had changed. Christianity was spreading rapidly across the empire, challenging ancient institutions. Temples that once represented divine order were now seen as centers of pagan idolatry. The Serapeum and the collection it sheltered stood directly in the path of history's new storm. Still, there were brief seasons of peace, moments when scholars of different faiths debated together instead of dividing. In the dim courtyards of the Serapeum, Greek philosophers discussed divine reason alongside Christian thinkers seeking to reconcile scripture with science. It must have been an extraordinary sight, the old gods and the new speaking side by side in the shadow of lost scrolls. The last great shadow. In 391 CE, amid intense religious conflict, Emperor Theodosius ordered all pagan temples to be closed. The Serapeum, once the proud vault of the library's surviving scrolls, was attacked and destroyed. In the uprising that followed, statues were shattered, manuscripts scattered or burned. The last quiet bastion of Alexandria's scholarship dissolved under fire and faith. It is not certain how much of the original collection still existed by then. Perhaps only fragments, perhaps enough to fill a few rooms. But with the fall of the Serapeum, an era ended, a millennium-old tradition of inquiry scattered to dust. The library that once dreamt of eternal preservation had finally met its opposite, deliberate forgetting. Between memory and mist. What followed was silence. 1,000 scholars' names vanished from record. The city changed hands, the harbor filled again, trade resumed, but the lineage of thinkers that once defined it faded from memory. Alexandria remained beautiful, but it was no longer a sanctuary of knowledge. The marble halls that echoed with debate now held only sea breeze and sand. Yet the paradox of the library's demise is that its spirit somehow survived. The knowledge born under its roof did not vanish entirely. Works of mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, translated, transmitted, and recopied, migrated into other hands. Scholars in Byzantium, Persia, and later, the Islamic Golden Age would inherit fragments of Alexandria's wisdom, embedding them in new worlds of study. The library, it seems, had transformed. Burned and broken, yes, but its ashes fertilized the soil of future understanding. In every monastery, every observatory, every scriptoria that followed, something of its breath remained. The silence that followed Alexandria's fall lasted not a moment, but an age. For centuries, its name lingered like a half-remembered song. Travelers spoke of it with awe and sorrow, chroniclers with disbelief. The library had slipped into legend, and in doing so, it became larger than life. Long after its stones were lost to the sea, people continued to see in Alexandria the image of what might have been, the perfect city of learning, the place where all thought was gathered and harmonized. It became, paradoxically, both real and imaginary, a ghost archive hovering between history and myth. The whisper through time. Even as the papyrus turned to dust, its contents did not truly die. Ideas have a peculiar habit of surviving their vessels. The scientific principles, the philosophical structures, the poetic forms, all these found new hosts. Translations carried them eastward to the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. In the great libraries of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, echoes of Alexandria reawakened. Arab philosophers studied Greek manuscripts carefully preserved and translated into Arabic. Texts attributed to Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy formed the backbone of new disciplines. It was as if the spirit of the library, scattered by fire, was carried by wind to distant lands where curiosity still thrived. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established centuries after the library's destruction, reflected this rebirth. Scholars there sought to translate and preserve all known works of philosophy and science, much as the Ptolemies once did. Across the desert sands, Far from the Mediterranean's edge, Alexandria lived anew, reborn in language and persistence. Myth and meaning. The more distant the library became, the grander its legend grew. Medieval chroniclers described it as an endless labyrinth of scrolls, millions upon millions, enough to swallow the centuries themselves. Renaissance thinkers, longing for intellectual revival, invoked its name as both inspiration and warning. The brilliance of humanity, matched only by its capacity for ruin. Painters depicted the fire as divine punishment, while philosophers saw it as the natural consequence of arrogance. Yet beyond all interpretations lay a simple truth. Alexandria's story reminded humanity of the cost of forgetting. Every lost manuscript spoke silently of a mind never again encountered, a discovery never remade. Knowledge, it seemed, was far more fragile than power had ever admitted. The memory of light. By the 19th century, archaeologists began to search for physical traces of the mythical library, probing the earth and harbor of modern Alexandria. Their finds were humble: stone foundations, fragments of columns, scattered inscriptions. No vast archive, no trove of papyri remained. And yet, standing by the sea, one could almost feel the past pressing close, as if the city itself mourned what time had taken. The modern mind, forever restless, could not let the dream fade. Writers and scientists invoked the library not only as history, but as metaphor. To some, it represented human potential; to others, the futility of seeking perfection. The library became a mirror we hold up to our own ambitions, a reminder that every pursuit of knowledge, however noble, exists in tension with impermanence. The rebirth of a vision. In the early years of the 21st century, a quiet resurrection took place. Along the Alexandrian coast, where once stood the ancient quarter of the Mausian, builders laid the foundation for a new library, a modern echo of the old one. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, completed in 2002, rose like a sun emerging from the sea. Its circular shape symbolizes the rising Helios, the eternal return of light. Upon its granite walls, scripts from hundreds of languages are carved, representing the universality of understanding. Inside, its tiers rise toward the glass ceiling, bathing readers in daylight fit for the descendants of those who once studied by lamplight. Here, the fragile dream found its second life. Within its archives now hum digital repositories exceeding the wildest imagination of the ancients. Billions of pages, millions of voices, all gathered not on papyrus, but in shimmering circuits of light. Yet even with all this abundance, the new library stands not as a monument of perfection, but of humility. It acknowledges its ancestry, its losses, and the delicate line between knowledge gained and wisdom understood. The library in us. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Alexandria lies not in its ruins or in the volumes that replaced it, but in the human condition it revealed. For as long as we seek to understand, we are rebuilding the library, scroll by scroll, question by question. Each act of curiosity becomes a restoration, each shared idea another stone laid in its immortal walls. In this sense, the library has never been destroyed. It was never a mere structure, but a living network of spirits connected by endeavor. Whenever a teacher opens a book, a child asks a question, or a scientist turns data into insight, a fragment of Alexandrian flame flickers once more. Knowledge is motion, not monument. The Alexandrians who measured the stars and mapped the body of man were not chasing certainty. They were courting the unknown with reverence. They believed that truth did not belong to any one civilization or creed, but to everyone capable of wonder. The sea and the stone. If you stand on the modern promenade of Alexandria at dusk, you can still see the water turn gold under the fading light. Out where the lighthouse of Pharos once guided travelers, waves crash softly against submerged ruins. Divers have found fragments of columns, statues of kings, granite lintels resting where marble once gleamed. The sea, as if unwilling to surrender, guards them in silence. And as the evening deepens, the distant hum of the city merges with the whisper of the tides. It is easy to believe that beneath those waters, the murmur of 1,000 pages continues, the rustle of papyrus turning beneath unseen hands. The final thought. The story of the Library of Alexandria endures because it is both triumph and elegy. It tells us that no collection, however grand, can imprison truth, that no destruction, however final, can erase humanity's desire to know. The library remains a symbol suspended between aspiration and loss, a flame that neither death nor time could fully extinguish. In the gentle resonance between what was and what remains, we discover what the Alexandrians may have understood all along. That knowledge is the most fragile and the most enduring of all human creations, bound to perish in one form only to be reborn in another. And so, as the waves brush the shore where marble once met sunlight, the story continues, not in the scraps of papyrus or the ash of lost books, but in us, who still look to the horizon and wonder. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the question it asked, how much can humanity understand of itself before forgetting again, still lingers, waiting to be opened, waiting to be read. There are moments in history when a single place becomes more than geography. It becomes a rhythm, an echo that never fully fades. Alexandria was such a place. Long after its fire cooled and its stones were scattered, the idea it represented continued to echo through the corridors of human thought. It moved unseen through languages, through inventions, through the countless hands that chose to write instead of forget. In the centuries that followed its loss, the dream of universal understanding reappeared in unexpected corners. Each time civilization reached again for unity, it unknowingly traced the outlines of that vanished library beside the sea. The long reflection. By the Middle Ages, the flame of inquiry that Alexandria had kindled was carried by scholars of many faiths, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and others, each tending a fragment of the light. In the great libraries of the East and West, its pulse continued. The translation movements in Baghdad, Toledo, and Venice served as silent heirs to the Ptolemies' ambition. There, under oil lamps and candlelight, scribes painstakingly transcribed texts rescued from oblivion. The geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Galen, and the philosophy of Aristotle all flowed back into circulation, reshaping how medieval minds conceived the world. Every newfound manuscript was a kind of resurrection, a small victory against time's indifference. It is humbling to imagine that many of these works, preserved through centuries of war and neglect, once rested on Alexandrian shelves. Legends tell that the scrolls found refuge in travelers' packs, merchant ships, and scholars' memories. Whether or not that is true, their survival feels like destiny, as if knowledge itself refused to die, no matter how often it burned. The Renaissance awakening. Centuries later, when Europe awoke from its medieval slumber, the Renaissance looked toward an invisible inheritance. Artists, scientists, and philosophers alike were drawn toward the memory of ancient Greece and Egypt, and therefore toward Alexandria. Humanists spoke of it not as myth, but as an ideal, a city that once dared to unite all truth. Its influence can be felt in every hall of learning founded during that age. The universities, the royal academies, the vast libraries that sought again to gather all knowledge under one roof. The ambition was reborn in parchment and ink, in the printing press that multiplied words faster than any scribe could dream. For the first time, knowledge began to travel faster than empires. The world was being stitched back together, slowly, imperfectly, by ideas. The Renaissance never rebuilt the Library of Alexandria from stone, but it restored its pulse in mind and manuscript. The enlightened flame. The centuries of enlightenment that followed brought a new dimension to that inheritance. Thinkers now questioned not only what could be known, but how knowledge itself could be measured, shared, and preserved. The scientific method, the encyclopedia, the universal catalog, all were spiritual descendants of Alexandria's first impulse, the belief that everything can be understood if enough minds cooperate in curiosity. Philosophers such as Bacon and Diderot imagined modern counterparts to the library, institutions that would guard human reason against ignorance. And although their efforts faced limits, the dream kept evolving, knowledge as the common inheritance of humankind, not the property of kings. Somewhere behind these visions lingered an ancient ghost, the image of scholars walking marble courtyards beneath the Pharos light, speaking softly in the mingled languages of their world. Alexandria's second dispersal. But each time the world gathers knowledge, it risks losing it again. The 20th century experienced its own fires, wars that destroyed archives, libraries, and universities. Once more, humanity saw how easily memory could perish. Yet among the ruins, the Alexandrian paradox endured. Destruction itself often provoked renewal. The survivors rebuilt, digitized, translated, and connected across borders. Databases replaced scrolls. Satellites and servers became new repositories of thought. The dream of all knowledge assembled resurfaced once again, though in a form no ancient philosopher could have foreseen. The digital Mausian. Today, our libraries no longer have walls of marble and columns of light. They exist in invisible structures of code, scattered across continents. The internet, in its most ideal form, mirrors the impulse of Alexandria, to collect, preserve, and share. Every web page, every archive, every shared lesson online echoes the ancient hallways where knowledge first took form. In this vast virtual landscape, every user becomes both librarian and scholar. The act of searching, reading, and connecting, often taken for granted, continues the lineage that began in the marble halls of the Mausian. Somewhere within the humming of data centers, one might even imagine the ghost of the old library stirring again, reborn as information without boundary. Yet, just as with the library, this new structure is fragile. It can be corrupted, overwhelmed, even erased. The lesson remains unchanged through all centuries. Knowledge demands not only creation, but care. The human archive. Beyond technology, there is a deeper truth. The most enduring library is not written on papyrus or encoded on servers. It is written within us. Each memory, each insight shared between generations, forms a page in an invisible book carried by humanity itself. You can close your eyes and hear the same murmur the ancient scholars once heard. Questions rising, answers forming, pages turning quietly in the wind. Every conversation, every act of curiosity, adds a new line to the unwritten volumes of our species. Somewhere in that endless text, the Library of Alexandria still resides. Not as architecture, but as an inner compass, reminding us that even in ignorance, we possess the urge to seek. Light refracted. If one were to imagine the library reborn, not in matter, but in spirit, it might look like this. A vast circle of light reflected across time, passing through countless lenses of culture, belief, and invention. It began as a flame guiding sailors. It lives now as the glow of a screen or the shimmer of thought in a child's mind. Every reflection is imperfect, yet together they form a mosaic of light that stretches across civilizations. The library's spirit, refracted through ages, reveals what we share, the need to understand and the longing to remember. The final horizon. There is a quiet lesson in the library's long journey. What we call loss is often transformation. The scrolls that burned became seeds of new philosophies. The myths that rose became blueprints for future institutions. Even fire, that eternal adversary of knowledge, becomes part of the cycle, clearing space for renewal. Alexandria teaches us that eternity is not the absence of death, but the continuity of purpose. As long as there are minds driven by wonder, there will be libraries, seen or unseen. As long as a question still trembles on the lips of humanity, there will be echoes of those marble halls by the sea. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, not the preservation of every answer, but the courage to keep asking. As the tide laps softly against the Alexandrian shore, the centuries fold into silence. The city listens, its heart still beating beneath the sand and salt. A faint shimmer of light ripples across the waves, perhaps a reflection of the sun, or perhaps something older than fire. For those who listen closely, it sounds almost like pages turning.